Today I'm going to talk about pandemic online learning and how I transitioned my course to a flipped classroom during the pandemic and how I'm going to transition it again for the upcoming fall 2022 term. So my outline of what I'm going to talk about today is a description of what a flipped classroom is. I'll talk about my own course, so NUFS 310, Nutrition, Education, and Communication. And I'll talk about how I converted a traditional classroom to a flipped classroom online. And then I'm also going to talk about how I'm going to convert my online flipped classroom to a conventional flipped classroom for the upcoming 2022 term in the fall. I am going to discuss how I made activities meaningful, both in an online and conventional flipped classroom. And lastly, I'm going to touch on some of the challenges that I encountered as I used a flipped classroom. Hopefully it will give you some ideas on using a flipped classroom. So in terms of definitions of a flipped classroom, a traditional classroom is where you have lectures and students come to listen to those lectures, and the professor will give assignments for the material that's covered in the lectures. A flipped classroom involves blended learning. So blended learning combines traditional face-to-face learning and e-learning. So when you have a flipped classroom, the instructor actually pre-records the lectures or pre-records the material in some asynchronous form. And then the students will watch or listen to those lectures before coming to class. And then that class time is really devoted more to active discussions, problem-solving activities, and activities that the students can engage in. So I just want to briefly talk about here how I have transitioned my own course. So I teach a third-year nutrition class, Nutrition, Education, and Communication. And prior to COVID, it was a traditional lecture class. It did have some in-class activities. So that when COVID hit, what we did is we converted this to an online flipped classroom. So we pre-recorded the lectures, and then we had different in-class activities in Zoom. And I'll talk more about that. Then in the upcoming fall 2022 term, I will continue to use a flipped classroom because it worked really, really well, where I will continue to use my pre-recorded lectures. But of course, instead of my activities being online, now my activities will be in an actual classroom, which will be really nice. So I decided to use a flipped classroom when the pandemic hit because there's a lot of advantages associated with using a flipped classroom. For example, a flipped classroom can produce greater student engagement, where students are better prepared to engage in higher order learning activities such as discussions, problem solving, debates, doing mock simulations, which I used a lot for my own course. It also promotes collaboration. So you have students working together, so they have to work with their peers. They have to work cooperatively. So they develop a lot of collaborative skills when they do this. It also fosters independence. So students will learn at their own pace. They take ownership of their learning, and it allows greater flexibility for students to access the asynchronous material. And because of this independence, students obtain a better understanding of the lectures before attending in class. So also, studies have found that learning performance can be higher with a flipped classroom or no different as compared to e-learning or face-to-face learning. Another advantage of a flipped classroom is that it can help instructors, so that if you have a planned absence where you have to attend a conference, you can plan for that in your outline. So the other thing is that students can get to know their instructors a lot more. During these class discussions, the instructors can work one-on-one or with groups of students. So you have more time to really get to know the students and to dedicate some time to guiding the students and giving them some feedback. And the last one, of course, guidance, which I just mentioned. So it provides increased individualized attention for the students. And the students also get some timely feedback, both from the instructor as well as from their peers. Now, I just wanted to elaborate a little bit more on how I kind of designed each class that I had in terms of my flipped classroom. So I had pre-recorded lectures that the students had to listen to. So I really worked hard to try and make these lectures engaging for my students. They were no longer than 15 minutes. They had questions embedded in the lectures that students had to answer that were part of a participation mark. And I added some music in there, which was fun. And I also had an outline at the beginning of each lecture and a what's next at the end of each lecture. So students would listen to these short instructional videos before class. And then during class, I would create exercises that the students had to complete in groups or in pairs, where it really implemented the material that was covered in those lectures. So the students had an opportunity really to practice what they learned, basically. So I really wanted to make sure, especially with COVID, that my experiences were meaningful, because if they weren't meaningful to the students, then it's not going to be an effective learning strategy. So I developed activities that were in line with the framework for strategies and practices in the Community of Inquiry conceptual framework to guide the design of my in-class activities. So I wanted to make sure that I created a social presence so that I was caring and committed. I always invited comments and questions, and I asked the students questions during class, both on Zoom and also through Mentimeter. And Mentimeter actually was a really good tool for students that were not quite as brave to say something in class. Mentimeter questions are all anonymous. So I think it was really good, a great opportunity for students also to give me some feedback and to get some feedback on some of the activities that they did. So I organized group activities. I had them switch on all their cameras. I also wanted to make sure that there was a cognitive presence. So I wanted to make sure that there was no more than 3 activities per session. And I learned this through experience, because putting too much in a session, a class activity, is just overwhelming for the students. And you're just trying to finish activities versus trying to learn the information. So I organized no more than 3 activities per class. I wanted to make sure I had a teaching presence. So I provided class instructions for the students. I had slides that I gave just in terms of reminders from the background information. I provided feedback after activities and during activities. So I hopped into Zoom breakout rooms and helped students guide their activities. I provided an opportunity for students to debrief about each activity. And I did this as well with those Mentimeter questions. And lastly, I wanted to make sure I captured and sustained their attention. So I had them turn on their webcams. I added some humor. I added variety. And actually what worked really well for my class is I provided a lot of demonstrations. And that added a lot of humor as well, because I often would provide examples on what not to do. So as I evolve then or transition to face-to-face activities, I've highlighted here in red really what I've got to change for my upcoming fall term. So I don't have to ask students to switch on cameras. I am going to ask students questions in class. However, there are always the students who don't participate as much. So I will see how things go. And I may actually continue to use Mentimeter just to try and address those different learning strategies or comfort levels of the students. In terms of my teaching presence, I don't have to drop into a Zoom breakout room. I can drop into group activities or pair activities. But I think one thing I have to be cognizant of is when I am giving feedback to make sure that it is personalized and private for that particular student or group, so that I'm physically separating the groups enough so that they can't overhear what group feedback other groups are getting. Again, I don't have to turn on webcams. Yay, mention that twice because that's a bonus. I get to see the students, which I'm excited about. And providing demonstrations will also be a little bit different, where I will actually have to do them in class. And I actually think that this will be more effective. So there are, of course, some challenges associated with using a flipped classroom. And one is handling the void, that quiet situation where you're asking for feedback, no one's saying anything, it's like crickets. So you have to really make sure you're creating engaging activities. And I think one thing I can't emphasize enough that helped me tons was practicing and planning, right? So having a really good lesson plan so that if there are those voids, then I have some backup questions I can ask. I can ask questions in a different way. So I can have some of these things planned. And then that way you're avoiding the emptiness of space and time when you are teaching. Now, student engagement, of course, is always a little bit challenging when you're asking for feedback or asking students to debrief. So asking the students who aren't participating will be easier in class. And again, maybe addressing the students that are not as confident to participate verbally in class, but using that Mentimeter function where students provide feedback anonymously might be a better strategy. So I'll have to see how that works. And how we teach changes considerably with activity-based learning. So some of us, it took me some practice to really not want to give all of the information because we're so used to giving all the information through a lecture. So really, again, what I did is I just provided a brief introduction of what I wanted them to know to successfully accomplish the activity. So again, I incorporated that into my practice plan, and I actually even practiced that as well. A couple times before class, I would just go through, what activity we're doing, when to ask those questions, especially if you're switching screens online, when I was using an online flipped classroom. But I will still continue to do that for my conventional conventional flipped classroom. Time is definitely needed to develop those videos and discussions and activities, and that's definitely a challenge for all of us. And just know that Rome wasn't built in a day. So just make sure that you're realistic on what activities you want to improve for your class and things that you want to incorporate into your class, because it all takes time. Slides, make sure I showed some slides during those activity-based classes, very few, but just some for instructions and some just to give them a little bit of background information. But I shared those slides before the class session so that they could bring them to class. And again, I often in the beginning when I used a flipped classroom, just make sure that there aren't too many activities in one class. You don't want to overwhelm the students. And students may feel that they are spending too much time in front of a screen. So I really can't emphasize enough to try and make that asynchronous content really engaging. So that is it for me. In conclusion, you can deliver a flipped classroom both online and conventionally. And a flipped classroom involves pre-recorded lectures with some in-class activities. And again, really encouraging student engagement with some of the tools that I described. And then identifying some of the challenges and creating some solutions for those challenges. And I know I've reached out to CTL many times, or other instructors, or my friends and colleagues, and they've really given me a helping hand.